I did not go looking for this story. I found it because the records would not behave. In the summer of 1846, along the coastal plantations of South Carolina, a series of entries appeared in ledgers that were never meant to raise questions. Births were recorded in the neat, indifferent hand of clerks who understood that ink mattered more than breath. Names, dates, sex, value. Then, months later, nothing. No corresponding deaths, no sales, no transfers. Children entered the world on paper and then slipped out of it without leaving so much as a smudge. At first, I assumed error, clerical laziness, missing pages, floods, fires, rats. Every archive has gaps. That is the first rule you learn. But these were not gaps. They were absences with edges. The children were described in the margins, rarely, quietly, as light. Sometimes very light. Once, explicitly, blue-eyed. That word appears only twice in 20 years of records. Both times, the page ends shortly after. I remember the moment the pattern emerged. It was late. The kind of late where the building settles and the air feels owned by no one. I had been cross-referencing plantation birth logs with county death rolls, expecting the usual attrition. Infant mortality was brutal and ordinary. But the numbers did not reconcile. Too many births, too few endings. I ran the comparison again, then again. If this could not happen, why did it keep happening? Before I go any further, I need to say this plainly. If you are reading this and you care about what is buried in records, about what survives despite intention, stay with me. These stories are not accidents. And if you are willing, mark where you are reading from. Geography matters more than we admit. The world I was studying did not operate on morality. It operated on ownership. Along the tidal rivers, the Ashpoo, the Combahee, the Edisto, plantations functioned as sealed systems. They generated their own truth. Law was distant. Reputation was immediate. What mattered was not what happened, but what could be proven. And proof lived on paper, controlled by the men who benefited from its order. Silence was not enforced with threats alone. It was enforced structurally. Enslaved people could not testify. Enslaved women could not accuse. Children did not exist as people at all, only as future entries in columns marked increase. If an entry ceased to be useful, it ceased to exist. This is where the impossible children appear. They were born in the quarters, not the big house, attended by women whose knowledge of birth exceeded anything found in medical texts of the period. The midwives noticed immediately. Light skin that did not darken, eyes that did not settle into brown, hair that refused the expected curl. These were not anomalies of illness. They were recognitions. The births were recorded because they had to be. A child was property, and property required documentation. But within months, never more than 9, the trail ended. No burial fees, no coffin purchases, no preacher's notes, no sales, which were meticulously tracked for tax purposes. Just disappearance. The official explanation, when there was one, was weakness. Failed to thrive. It is a phrase that does a lot of work. It suggests inevitability, nature, God. It requires no follow-up. But the women did not accept it. I found their resistance only indirectly, years later, in the margins of unrelated documents. A midwife's mark repeated in private notebooks. A house servant's careful preservation of scraps. Dates folded into hems. Names whispered to daughters who were told to remember, even when they could never speak them aloud. An invisible archive began to form, not on shelves, but in people. At the center of the first cluster of cases was a man whose name appears often and never directly. A planter with ambitions larger than his acreage. A family line in need of purity. A reputation that could not survive rumor. One child, born in the winter of 1848, forced his hand. I know this because the handwriting changes. The entry is shakier than the rest. The description is longer. The valuation is left blank. And 3 months later, the page is torn. Not removed cleanly, but ripped, as if done quickly, angrily. That was the first decision. Not cruelty. Fear. Fear of inheritance disputes. Fear of wives who asked questions. Fear of other men who understood the arithmetic of skin and time as well as he did. The child was not a person to him. It was a liability with a face. The decision felt temporary, a solution until the problem could be made to vanish. What he activated instead was a mechanism, quiet, efficient, repeatable. Children became assets to be relocated. Silence became routine. Women learned which babies would be allowed to live openly and which would be absorbed into something else, somewhere else. I cannot prove where the children went. That is the point. What I can prove is that they did not die where the paper says they should have. And I can prove that the system that erased them functioned perfectly because everyone involved understood the cost of interruption. Every time I thought I had reached the end of the trail, I found another inconsistency. Another ledger that balanced too neatly. Another absence shaped exactly like a child. History teaches us to look for evidence. This story taught me to look for what refuses to be recorded. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I had to stop pretending this world was governed by laws. That realization came slowly, the way rot announces itself not by collapse, but by smell. On paper, the plantations of coastal South Carolina existed inside a framework of statutes, codes, and ordinances. Slave codes, property law, county oversight. Everything appeared regulated, documented, orderly. But none of those rules explained what I was seeing. None of them accounted for children who entered records cleanly and then slid out of existence without consequence. The real rules were unwritten, but everyone understood them. Ownership came first. Not just ownership of land or people, but ownership of narrative. Whoever controlled the paper controlled reality. Ledgers did not describe the world, they produced it. If something did not appear in ink, it was not merely unproven, it was unspeakable. Silence was not a moral failure in this system. It was currency. Enslaved people had no legal voice, which is a familiar fact, but the silence imposed on enslaved women was deeper, more absolute. Their bodies were sites of labor and reproduction, nothing more. Pregnancy was monitored for profit, not care. Birth was valuable only insofar as it promised future return. Anything that disrupted that calculus became dangerous. Everyone knew this. Midwives knew it. Overseers knew it. The men who owned the plantations understood it most clearly of all. The rule was simple. If a child disappeared, it was because the system required it to. Asking why was interpreted not as curiosity, but as threat. I found no written order that said, "Remove these children." There was no directive, no policy, no formal mechanism. That is what made it effective. The system did not need to explain itself. It only needed participants who understood when to look away. Plantation life operated like a closed circuit. Problems were resolved internally. External scrutiny was avoided at all costs. County officials relied on planters for revenue and stability. Ministers relied on them for patronage. Doctors relied on them for access and payment. No one benefited from disturbing the surface. If a mother asked questions, she could be sold. If a midwife spoke too openly, she could be reassigned, punished, or simply removed. If an overseer noticed inconsistencies and pressed the issue, his employment would end, and with it, his livelihood. The threat did not have to be spoken. It was ambient. Paper mattered more than people because paper traveled. A person could scream and be forgotten. A document could outlive everyone in the room. And yet, even paper had limits. What struck me most as I continued through the archives was how careful the erasures were. Not sloppy, not panicked, surgical. Birth records remained intact. The disappearance happened later, quietly, after value had been assessed and danger calculated. The system allowed itself time to decide. This is where historians often reach for abstraction. Terms like patriarchy, racial hierarchy, economic incentive. All of those apply, but they do not capture the intimacy of the rule set. This was not distant ideology. This was a daily, lived understanding shared by everyone involved. The enslaved women understood that speaking meant loss, of children, of kin, of life as they knew it. The white women understood that asking questions endangered their marriages, their inheritance, their standing. The men understood that reputation was more fragile than cruelty. And the children, of course, understood nothing at all. When I say the system required it, I mean something precise. These children represented a contradiction the plantation world could not absorb. They threatened the visual logic of ownership. They made private acts visible. They forced acknowledgement of relationships that the law refused to name. So the system did what systems do. It corrected. The terrifying part is not that this happened. It is that it happened smoothly, repeatedly, without documentation, because documentation was the threat. Silence became routine. Absence became normalized. By the time I reached the later records, I could predict the outcome before I turned the page. Light description, no follow-up, no death, no sale. Gone. And everyone went on living inside that arrangement. Because to question it would destroy not just individuals, but the fragile consensus that kept the world functioning. This was not a conspiracy in the way people imagine conspiracies. There were no meetings, no oaths, just shared incentives and mutual fear. And once I understood the rules of that world, I knew the story was never about whether the disappearances were real. It was about why they were necessary. The first time the system faltered was not in the quarters, but in the big house. I know this because the record suddenly becomes personal. Not in tone, nothing so careless, but in pressure. You can feel it in the way entries tighten, in the way handwriting loses its ease. Someone was no longer managing an abstraction. Someone was confronting a fact that refused to stay theoretical. The child was born late in the year, during a season when illness and death were common enough to disguise almost anything. But this child did not arrive quietly. The women knew it immediately, and so did the man who owned the plantation, though he would not see the child for weeks. He did not need to. The timing alone was enough. The weeks he had spent at home, the absence of his wife during the birth, the rumors he had already learned to ignore until they became inconvenient. By the time word reached him, carefully phrased, stripped of implication, he already understood what existed in the quarters. A child whose presence threatened inheritance, reputation, and social standing. This is the point where people expect cruelty. A decision made in anger. A command delivered with violence. But the documents suggest something quieter and far more dangerous. Hesitation. The plantation owner delayed. No immediate punishment. No dramatic response. The birth was logged. The valuation left blank. That alone was unusual. Value was certainty. Leaving it open meant indecision. I imagine him convincing himself this could be handled discreetly, that the child might darken with time, that illness might intervene, that distance could solve what confrontation could not. The choice he made felt, to him, temporary. That is how systems recruit participants. The first action was small. The child was moved, not sold, not documented, sent away under the guise of care, of arrangement, of necessity. The paper trail thinned deliberately. The mother was told nothing that could be repeated. This was not framed as cruelty. It was framed as protection of the household, of the future, of everyone involved. The owner likely believed this. Fear is very good at masquerading as reason. But the moment that child vanished from daily sight, something irreversible occurred. A precedent was set. A mechanism activated. What began as a singular problem became a solution waiting for repetition. The owner learned that silence could be managed. That removal did not require explanation if paperwork remained clean. That the women who knew would survive by not speaking, because survival was already something they had mastered. I found evidence of this realization in later entries. Efficiency improved. Descriptions shortened. Gaps appeared more confidently. What had been a crisis became a process. The tragedy is not that the owner lost his humanity in that moment. It is that he did not have to. The system absorbed the decision and normalized it. He did not need to become monstrous. He only needed to be afraid of losing what he already had. From that point forward, children were no longer just births. They were risks to be assessed. If the child blended, the system allowed it to remain. If the child contradicted the visual order of ownership, the system corrected. Each decision reinforced the last. Each removal made the next easier. The owner could now tell himself a story. That this was rare, unfortunate, necessary. That no one was truly harmed. That the alternative, exposure, scandal, loss, would have destroyed far more lives. This is how power justifies itself. Not with ideology, but with arithmetic. One child weighed against land, against name, against lineage. The first choice did not feel final. That is what made it lethal. Because once the mechanism existed, it no longer belonged to him alone. Others observed. Others learned. The system did not require command. It only required imitation. And somewhere in the quarters, a mother understood that her child had been transformed into something else entirely. Not dead, not alive, but erased. In a way that could never be mourned openly. That was the moment the disappearances stopped being anomalies. That was the moment they became routine. By the time the pattern solidified, there were already too many witnesses. This is the lie the system depended on, that silence meant ignorance. In reality, silence meant coordination. The mothers knew. The midwives knew. The house servants knew. because they were the ones sent to carry bundles that were not luggage, to wash linens that told stories without words, to scrub rooms that had briefly held something alive. Even an overseer knew. At least one. I found him only indirectly, through a complaint filed years later about his unsuitable temperament. He noticed discrepancies. He asked why births were logged but never followed by expected increases in labor roles. He was not moral. He was methodical. That was enough to make him dangerous. He was dismissed within the year. What fascinates me is not that these people knew, but what they did with that knowledge. They could not speak openly. Speech belonged to those who owned paper. But silence did not mean passivity. The resistance that formed was quiet and meticulous. Midwives began to hide identifying marks. A faint curl of hair clipped and preserved. A birthmark memorized and described in whispered detail. Names repeated over and over, not written down, but anchored in memory so firmly they could survive decades. Mothers sang certain melodies only once, at birth, encoding names in rhythm because music traveled where language could not. House servants kept scraps, tiny things that would look like trash to anyone else. A corner of cloth, a date scratched into wood behind a bed frame, a bead removed from a string and hidden in a pocket. None of it proved anything alone. Together, it formed something fragile and defiant, an invisible archive. It did not exist in one place. That would have made it vulnerable. It lived in people, in repetition, in the discipline of remembering without recording. I began to see traces of it much later, when those people were long dead. A granddaughter insisting on a name no document supported. A family Bible with gaps where births should be, but marginal notes that hinted at more. Oral histories dismissed by early historians as superstition or confusion because they did not align neatly with official timelines. They were not confused. They were encrypted. The women understood something the men did not, that paper could be destroyed, but memory, distributed carefully, could endure. They did not expect justice. They did not expect recovery. What they wanted was survival of truth, even if that truth could never be spoken aloud. This was dangerous work, not heroic in the way we like to imagine, but exhausting and risky. Forgetting would have been easier. Forgetting would have kept them safer. But forgetting would have meant accepting the system's version of reality. So they remembered instead. Each act was small, each one deniable. No single woman held enough information to expose the whole mechanism. That was deliberate. Protection through fragmentation. The same logic the system used turned quietly against it. I imagine the discipline it required. To watch a child disappear and not scream. To know a name and never say it in the wrong place. To live inside a truth you were forbidden to acknowledge. This was not silence born of submission. It was silence, sharpened into a tool. When historians later complained about the lack of evidence, I wanted to ask what kind they expected. Confessions? Official memos? The system that committed the erasure also controlled the archive. The only place resistance could survive was outside of it. And it did. The invisible archive did not stop the disappearances. It was never powerful enough for that. But it did something else, something subtler. It ensured that the system never fully succeeded in convincing everyone that nothing had happened. Even now, reading between the lines, I can feel their presence. The careful absences, the stubborn inconsistencies, the way certain names refuse to disappear completely. resurfacing generations later without explanation. These witnesses had no voice in court, no standing in history books. But they left something behind anyway, a trace that could not be fully erased. And that trace is the reason I am writing this at all. The system did not collapse because of outrage. It never does. It faltered because patterns leak. By the early 1850s, the disappearances had accumulated enough residue to become visible, not as proof, but as discomfort. Children who should have existed did not. Women who should have been broken were too precise in their silences. Documents aligned too cleanly, as if scrubbed by a hand that understood exactly what inspectors expected to see. The first crack appeared where no one intended to look. Inheritance. I found it in probate disputes, minor ones, easily dismissed, where distant relatives challenged valuations. Numbers were questioned. Labor counts did not match acreage. Birth totals failed to produce expected returns. On paper, nothing was wrong. But the math felt off, and men who lived by arithmetic noticed. Then came the similarities. Two households, miles apart, producing children described in nearly identical language. Two sets of records ending the same way. A clerk reusing phrasing without realizing it created a fingerprint. Consistency, in this case, became a liability. Warnings began to circulate. Never openly. Notes slipped into conversations. A minister declining to officiate a burial because no body existed. A doctor refusing to certify a death he had never witnessed. A letter sent anonymously, advising discretion, advising caution, advising silence before someone else noticed first. This was the dead end. Exposure would have destroyed everyone involved, not just the owners, but their wives, their sons, the local officials who had signed off, the ministers who had looked away. The invisible archive held by the women could not be weaponized without destroying them too. There was no clean resolution, only containment. The choice was made collectively, though no meeting records it. The threat would be eliminated, not corrected, not confessed. Removed. The records grow colder after this point. Less variation, fewer descriptive words. Births reduced to bare minimum entries. Anything that invited attention was stripped away. The system tightened. And then, one of the mothers vanished. Her removal is the only disappearance that is documented, because it needed to be. A sale recorded at a distance far enough to sever memory. No follow-up, no transfer back. She does not reappear in any ledger I have found. Her child had already been taken. This was not punishment. It was erasure insurance. Once that happened, the rest fell into line. The midwives retreated further into silence. The servants destroyed what scraps they could not safely carry. The overseer who might have spoken had already been dismissed. The potential leak was sealed. Officially, the matter ended there. Later records show no anomalies, or fewer that can be traced. The mechanism had learned from its own exposure. It became more efficient, more cautious, less visible. On paper, the system won. But something else happened too. The fear changed sides. From that point forward, the archive itself became defensive. Clerks copied without curiosity. Officials avoided detail. Everyone involved understood that asking questions now carried risk. The silence hardened, not just among the powerless, but among those who benefited. When historians later wondered why the trail went cold, they assumed resolution. They were wrong. What happened was professionalization of forgetting. I have learned to recognize this phase in other systems of power, the moment when wrongdoing stops being chaotic and becomes procedural. When the greatest threat is not discovery, but inconsistency. That is the dead end. There is no triumph here, no justice delayed, only stabilization. The woman who was sold did not leave a diary. The children do not reappear under new names in any register I have found. Whatever lives they lived were absorbed into another world, another paper reality, sealed behind legality. And yet, the system's victory was incomplete. Because the act of eliminating the threat did not erase the memory of the threat. It only buried it deeper, distributing it more widely, embedding it in ways that paper could no longer fully contain. The records close. The case ends. History moves on. But not everything stays buried just because it is quiet. After the sale, the records behave the way records do when they believe they are safe. The handwriting steadies. The margins clear. The entries resume their unremarkable rhythm of births, yields, repairs, and losses. No more descriptive language. No more hesitation. The plantation returns to order, at least on paper. This is the phase that tempts historians to stop looking. The case appears closed, the anomaly resolved. Whatever had been happening no longer announces itself. And yet, I could not shake the sense that something fundamental had shifted, not ended, but completed. Because what followed was not absence. It was replacement. Children began to appear elsewhere, not as enslaved, but as white. Not immediately, not conspicuously. Quiet insertions into households already positioned to absorb them. Orphans of distant relations, wards taken in out of charity. Kin whose origins were vague enough to discourage inquiry. These entries exist. I found them only by accident, cross-referencing church baptisms with census data years later. Children with no recorded mothers. Ages that drift slightly between documents. Birthplaces listed as counties rather than towns, plantations rather than homes. Legally, it worked. The law did not require proof of origin, only consistency. Once the paper trail was established, it became self-reinforcing. A child baptized white became white. A child educated white remained white. Property could be inherited. Names could persist. The crime was not just concealed, it was converted. I am careful here because this is where speculation becomes dangerous. I cannot prove every case. I cannot trace every life. The system ensured that. But the structure is visible. The pattern repeats with enough regularity to suggest design, not coincidence. This was the final resolution. The mother removed. The records cleansed. The children absorbed into a world that would never acknowledge the cost of their entry. The plantation system did not merely erase the evidence of its contradiction. It reclassified it. On paper, the system won completely. No laws were broken that the law was willing to recognize. No violence needed to be documented. No scandal reached the surface. The mechanism closed itself and left behind nothing that demanded explanation. And yet, this was not a clean victory. Because conversion requires silence from everyone involved, forever. The women who remained knew what had happened. They carried the knowledge of children living lives that could never include them. That kind of loss does not behave like death. It has no rituals, no end point. It simply persists. The men who benefited knew as well. They lived with the knowledge that their legitimacy rested on suppression, that their names, their lines, their futures were protected not by virtue, but by coordinated forgetting. Even the children, especially the children, paid a price. Identity is not just what you are told, it is what your body remembers. Displacement leaves traces that no document can fully smooth away. The past has a way of leaking through posture, through unease, through questions that feel forbidden without knowing why. This is what makes the resolution irreversible. Once the system committed to rewriting people rather than acknowledging them, there was no path back. To undo it would have required unraveling entire families, estates, and reputations. The cost was too high for anyone with power to bear. So history accepted the rewrite. The records moved forward. The war came. Slavery ended. New systems of power replaced the old ones. The original crime receded into irrelevance, sealed behind legality and time. But resolution is not the same as erasure. What survived was not proof, but distortion. Enough to unsettle, not enough to indict. Enough to trouble the margins of history without ever entering its center. When I reached this point in the research, I understood something that had taken me years to accept. There would be no final document, no confession, no ledger that tied it all together neatly. The truth had been processed into something else. And that, perhaps, was the system's most enduring success. I reached the end of the archive long before I reached the end of the story. That is the final imbalance this system leaves behind. The records stop, but the questions do not. They linger in the spaces between documents, in the inconsistencies historians footnote and then move past. I did what every researcher eventually does. I followed the fragments instead. A personal note tucked inside a Bible with no provenance. A baptismal certificate corrected twice in different ink. Census entries where a child's age shifts forward and backward as if time itself hesitated. Oral histories recorded decades later that refuse to align with official chronologies yet agree with each other in ways coincidence cannot explain. None of it is enough to prove the crime cleanly. All of it is enough to prove the erasure failed. What remains is not a ledger that says this happened. It is a pattern that says something was done, repeatedly, deliberately, and with extraordinary care. The system succeeded in preventing exposure, but it could not prevent residue. Power is very good at closing cases. It is far less effective at eliminating traces. I used to think the most important question was how many children were taken. I no longer believe that number can be known. The mechanism was designed to defeat counting. Once the children were rewritten into another category, they stopped being traceable as losses. They became gains elsewhere. That arithmetic disappears into respectability. The more unsettling question is how many stories vanished with them. How many mothers lived their lives knowing their children existed somewhere they could never reach? How many people grew up sensing an absence in their origin, a discontinuity they could never name without risking everything they had been given? How many family lines were stabilized by silence and could not survive its removal? This is where the story refuses closure. Because history did not correct itself. It moved on. New injustices replaced old ones. New systems learned from the efficiency of the previous ones. The original crime dissolved into the background conditions of American life. And yet, here I am writing this. Not because I believe exposure will fix what was done. It will not. The people involved are long dead. The children, if they lived full lives, carried truths they were never allowed to speak. I write because forgetting was the final goal. The system depended on the assumption that once the paper was clean, time would do the rest. That memory would die with the powerless. That absence would eventually look like nothing at all. It was wrong. What survives is not certainty, but disturbance. a refusal of the past to sit quietly, a sense that the archive, for all its authority, is incomplete by design. I cannot tell you exactly how many children were taken. I can tell you this: enough that the system had to learn how to hide them better. And that tells me everything I need to know.